Were there any questions? Yes, please.
Would you define neocons versus cons?
Sure.
Exactly.
In terms of the neoconservatives, aside from the point which was already elucidated with regard to Russell Kirk, they tend to be the forces behind a notion of American exceptionalism which believes that the American ideas with regard to government, culture, business, etc., are the template for all nations in the world. And so therefore, we can make Iraq better by sending, 1 million troops in and reshaping their society into a copy of our own. That theirs tends to be a militant doctrine that seeks that kind of an imposition. The highest measure of value is primarily in terms of economic success, and so it would be a neocon understanding. And so therefore, affluence is the measure of a success in politics or in ideology. Whereas for a conservative, we would see it in the preservation of a traditional society, a preservation of the family, a cultivation of traditional institutions. The neoconservative is not as concerned for matters of church, family. Well, a classic example of this that played out recently was in a debate between Ben Shapiro, very much in the category of neoconservative, over against Tucker Carlson, who tends to be more of a traditional conservative, where the breaking point between them was Carlson would have no problem with the idea of restricting the elimination of jobs by simply switching everything over to robotics, for example. He saw this as a pernicious thing because you are dissolving communities, you are breaking up families, you were depriving them of their breadwinner. And for Shapiro, it was strictly a matter of, but there's all of this money to be made, and how can that possibly be bad? And that the business of America is business. These are elucidating some of the differences between the two.
Both of those have aspects of truth to them.
Yes.
Both of them.
And that's
not the whole.
And see, and this goes to Kirk's point in the conservative canons, which I think is quite wise, where he says that progress cannot simply be seen as a good in and of itself. There must be change, but it's change which must be managed. That change is not inherently something which is good for society or for even individuals, but rather we need to be aware of the impact of any societal changes in politics and business, etc., and be aware of what they'll do beyond the narrow scope of one person's economic concern.
One more question in this
Please.
regard. You mean the neocons took no recognition of what Muslim culture and society does? Just because, I mean, that is so obvious.
They are the ones
antithetical to Western civilization. They must be blind.
Well, if we can just think back to how that whole debacle began, was with a neoconservative false dichotomy between the good Muslims who, in other words, don't do what Islam does, and the bad Muslims who, as remember, we heard this for years under Bush and Cheney, that they were, they were therefore, not good Muslims if they were engaged in jihad, something which would have come as quite a shock to Muhammad himself. I mean, it's that kind of a blind, that they can stand back and tell a Muslim, you're not a good Muslim, because you don't agree with me as to what Islam should be. I would see that as something which is probably for them to define themselves, and have defined, not only in terms of the Quran, but also the Hadith. You can look at the writings of Islam, and you can look at the history of Islam and know what Islam is. And it doesn't take very long to look at that and say, whatever the ideology is that was guiding several administrations in a row, it's a fantasy. And yet that was something which went seamlessly from the Bush administration into the Obama administration. Everybody was all agreed that somewhere out there were these vast ranks of good Muslims that didn't persecute Christians and burn down churches and blow up buildings, etc. And of course, as a result, they made the situation vastly worse because we went in with troops, overthrew governments, couldn't build anything in their place because governments are not something which are artificially constructed if they're going to last. you can't sweep aside the institutions of an entire country and then say, well, now remake yourselves as Americans. They're going to build a body politic according to the structure of their own society, their core beliefs. And so Iraq and Afghanistan were a failure from before we went in terms of the goals of the invasions and occupations. They had to fail because what we were trying to do was guided by an ideology and not by sanity. So I would see that as a major difference. Please.
The caliphate is what they set up and tried to set up.
Right.
That was more artificial, or was it you?
Oh, not being an expert in the Middle East, the difference between the caliphate, to what extent was it real and what was it false? It was guided by a notion of something which they once endeavored to institute. I mean, the caliphate used to be. But I think what you had there was a particular group of Islamists who saw that as a means to carve out for themselves their own place within the Muslim world, and that the institutions and countries that already existed in the Islamic world didn't really feel like turning everything over to, these whippersnappers who were trying to make up their own country. Which, by the way, contrary to the delusions of the neocons who seem to think that the solution to every problem in the world is American force of arms, if there's a problem in the Middle East, most of the time, the Middle Eastern powers are fully capable of resolving it. If you're having a problem with a caliphate, get out of the way and allow Syria, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel to deal with the problem. We need to begin to learn once more the distinction between our problem and not our problem. And it's this endless cultivation of entangling alliances that is what's really damaging our policy. Well, and so much of it's rooted in historical fiction. Yes?
What about Secretary of State's Mike Pompeo's demand that was made to Middle Eastern governments at all to decriminalize homosexuality? And
see, again, that's part of the neocon fantasy of we can just impose upon them something which is not part of their culture. It's you look at something like that, and on the face of it, it's going to generate outrage from anyone who, in that part of the world, who takes their religion seriously. And there, you're not talking about merely the most extreme wing. You're talking about anyone who believes their faith at all. So, hubris, ideology, and the desire to impose in this case, American decadence on other countries is appalling. It's interesting how quick they are to export the absolute worst that we have to offer. And in the case of trying to impose homosexuality on these countries, I would certainly see that as a leading problem in that regard. Other questions? How can I be offensive in other ways? I think that's got it covered, unless there's any last words. Thank you.
Thank you. All righty, well, I'll be back at the literature table. And again, it's good. I saw Ken Jensen